Hi, my name is Sophie, and I am 34 years old. I never imagined returning to my parents' home like this. At the dinner table, crystal glasses sparkled under chandelier light. Then my mother's voice sliced through the room like glass. "You're not even worth a beggar." Forks froze midair, relatives stiffened, and silence swallowed the air. Heat rose across my cheeks, humiliation searing me to the bone. But I didn't flinch, not this time, not anymore. Because they had no idea who I had become. In 5 minutes, their version of me would collapse. In the My House, excellence wasn't celebrated, it was assumed. My mother, Dr. Elizabeth, ran cardiology like a metronome of perfection. My father billed hours and negotiated quietly from paneled conference rooms. Our dinner talk was metrics, rankings, and what counts in Boston. Brian absorbed calculus like rain. I sketched interfaces on napkins. When I brought home an A-, Mom circled the one wrong answer. "This is why you'll never be a doctor," she said, unblinking. I was 12. The sentence calcified like a bone set crooked. I built websites after homework, stitched color into empty grids. She skimmed my mock-ups the way surgeons check vitals. Briefly, clinically. "Art doesn't pay bills, Sophie. Be practical, be respectable." Respectable meant lab coats, courtrooms, letters pinned after your name. The house grew colder as my folders grew brighter. Awards slid into drawers. Praise slid past me toward Brian's trophies. Dad stayed neutral, a soft echo in a hard hallway. "Your mother wants the best for you," was his closing argument. By senior year, I stopped auditioning for a part I'd never get. I applied to a university strong in digital arts and computer science. Partial scholarship in hand, I chose the life that chose me. Mom's face went crimson. The verdict slammed like a gavel. No daughter of mine will waste her potential on doodles and computers. Pre-med or nothing, your choice. I chose nothing, meaning not yours. The next morning, I packed a Honda with boxes and nerve. Independence was a studio with a stubborn radiator and thin walls. Barista at dawn, retail by noon. Design gigs past midnight. Ramen, rent, loops of YouTube lectures, syntax errors like mosquito bites. Sleep was a rumor. Ambition was the only currency that cleared. Community college kept tuition sane and momentum pointed forward. Python clicked. Human-centered design felt like oxygen after winter. No one asked for Brian's shadow at the registrar's desk. No one compared me to a med school brochure on the fridge. I still called home sometimes, then learned to stop explaining. "Working with computers," I'd say, and swallow the rest whole. Silence stretches into habit. Habit turns into armor you outgrow. I needed more than survival. I needed a door that opened. A local tech conference traded my poster for a free badge. I printed comps, carried hope in a backpack with dead pens. I walked in small, hungry, and ready to learn anything. I didn't know it yet, but a stranger would notice everything. I thought distance would heal. In truth, it sharpened my aim. And that badge hanging crooked on my sweater was my first map. What she said next would become background noise. What I built next wouldn't. The keynote lights were bright. My badge hung crooked. Brave. After her talk, I waited with a portfolio and a tremor. "Jennifer Lawson," the placard read. "Garage to unicorn. Product whisperer." She studied my screens the way pilots study weather. "You don't decorate," she said. "You design for decisions." She slid me a card and a test. "Prototype this flow. No polish. Show how it thinks." I worked until sunrise. By Monday, I had a part-time seat and a mentor. Classes by morning, stand-ups at noon, commits after dark. "Never apologize for your passion," Jennifer said over coffee. "The world has enough reluctant doctors. Burn for what you are." I learned how roadmaps lie when research is lazy, how to price value, and to listen until pain points speak. 2 years condensed into one sentence. I could build. Diploma in hand, offers arrived like expensive confetti. I chose a mid-size firm with survivable politics. Junior designer to project lead. Curiosity scaled better than ego. Still, the garage stories kept tapping at night. So I saved every bonus and wrote a one-page plan. Nexus Solutions began in a rented corner with stubborn Wi-Fi. An AI-assisted UX platform that learned from behavior, not guesses. Week 5, a pilot. Week 12, a letter of intent. Year 1, 2 anchors, 3 hires. Year 2, we moved downtown and stopped pretending to be temporary. We paid design debt like real debt and slept better. By year 3, 20 people, whiteboards for walls. Revenue passed 7 figures. Audits stopped scaring us. A magazine put me in 30 under 30. I smiled, fixed onboarding friction, and went back to work. I kept my car and apartment. Money fed product and people. At night, I drafted the culture I needed as a kid. No comparison as motivation. Feedback without contempt. Celebrate wins in the room. Hire for curiosity. Promote for courage under uncertainty. Family calls stayed short and vague by design. Work's fine, I'd say, then ask about weather. I wasn't hiding. I was protecting roots. Some trees die when you dig them up to brag. I kept RSVPing regrets to reunions and breathed easier. But even righteous secrets get heavy. When the reunion invite came, I pinned it to cork. An inevitable test. I'd spent years teaching systems to reflect truth clearly. Time to do the same with family. The next room wouldn't get a performance. It would get proof. The Matthews house hadn't changed. Hedges straight as rules. I arrived with a small gift and a smaller appetite. Appetizers circled, whispers did too. So, still doing computers? A cousin asked. Still, I said and let it stand. We sat. China chimed. Aunt Teresa smiled. Mom tapped her glass. The room obeyed. Family is everything, she said, skimming resumes, not faces. She praised Brian's paper. Titles counted like beads. Then her gaze found me, cool and clinical. And Sophie is here, working with computers, I believe. A thin laugh rustled, heat rose and stopped. I met her eyes and didn't blink. She wasn't finished. She never is when rooms listen. We gave her every advantage. She chose another path. Pause. Tilt. Scalpel smile. You're not even worth a beggar. Forks froze. A glass clicked wrong. I breathed once, slow enough to hear it. The old me would have fled. This one didn't. Wait, Alex blurted. 16 hoodie, phone in orbit. Are you the Sophie Matthews from Nexus Solutions? The name hit the table like a dropped mic. Mom blinked. From what? Alex was already scrolling, thumbs flying evidence. Tech innovators, look! He turned the screen, brightness full. My headshot, our lobby. A pull quote on ethical AI. Banner 30 under 30, human-centered systems at scale. The phone did a lap. Disbelief traded seats with curiosity. Aunt Patricia gaped. Uncle Robert leaned in like money listens. Brian stared, recalculating the math of our childhood. Dad's hand found my shoulder, light and steady. Is this true? He asked, voice thin but holding. It is, I said. No embroidery. No apology. What do you do exactly? Someone tried, careful now. Build tools that learn from people and return respect. Alex tapped again. A video sprang to life. My voice traced consent, bias, measurable benefit, audit trails. Rumor gave way to competence. The silence changed color. No longer contempt, now listening, weight placed differently. Mom watched the clip like it owed her an answer. You said you were working with computers, she managed. You never asked, I said. You assumed. The sentence landed and didn't move. Questions replaced verdicts, awkward but honest. Team size? Clients? Funding or profits? 20, I said. Fortune accounts. Ethics before launch. Cash flow positive. Boring margins. Better sleep. Aunt Teresa lifted her tea and winked. About time. Brian's voice cracked open. Sophie, this is incredible. Not loud. Real. Enough to stand on. Dad exhaled like a verdict released. Proud of you. Across the linen, Mom's face misfired expressions. Control, doubt, calculation. None fit. The room she curated slipped from her grip. For once, it was holding me. Dessert arrived to a table already sweetened by proof. I hadn't raised my voice or pedigree. I'd raised evidence you could scroll, play, and pass. I answered 2 more questions, corrected 1 rumor, and stopped. No audition, no victory lap, just air I could breathe. Under the chandelier, a storm still gathered behind her eyes. The reveal quieted the room. But quiet is just the eye when a mother hates losing weather. I stepped onto the porch. The night air bit clean. The door sighed shut behind me like a lid on steam. A minute later, heels measured breath, my mother's entrance. We faced the yard like witnesses to different crimes. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, voice smaller than habit. Would you have believed me? I said. Not sharp, just true. All these years, I thought you were wasting potential. No, I said. You decided I was. That fit your story. Her jaw worked, searching for a gavel that wasn't there. I pushed you to succeed. That's what mothers do. You pushed me into you, I said. Not the same. And humiliating me tonight? That wasn't love, it was control. She flinched, an unarmored wince I'd never seen. It hurt more than you knew, I added. Always did. I won't perform again. These are the boundaries. No comparisons, no public corrections. If disrespected, I leave. Her eyes flashed. So you're setting rules for your mother? No, for me. Respect is the dress code if you want me here. The porch light hummed. My words stayed unshaken. The door opened. Brian stepped out, cautious but real. I'm sorry, he said fast before courage could leak. I let the comparisons stand. I stayed quiet, benefited. I told myself you chose easy so I could feel brave. You didn't choose easy, I said. You chose assigned. He laughed once, brittle. You're not wrong. I'm good at surgery. I never chose it freely. Your nerve tonight. I've envied that for years. Silence stretched, lighter than it used to be. Nexus is piloting medtech interfaces, I said, almost casual. If you want in, consult. No pageantry. Just work, credit. His shoulders eased. I'd like that. I'd like to be your brother, too. Then Dad appeared in the doorway, older, softer. I'm proud of you, he said. No ceremony, just oxygen. It landed where approval belongs, steady, on the ground. Thanks, I said. Say it to yourself sometimes, too. Back inside, the table resumed its practice theater. Some faces looked new with respect. Others stayed old with habit. I didn't need either to feel whole while I ate. Mom returned, crown intact but cracks visible. She raised her glass, voice even, words without dagger. To Aunt Teresa, she said, and to unexpected gifts. I didn't toast or translate. I simply let it stand. At the door, she hovered, words forming, not falling. I heard your boundaries, she said quietly. I can try. Trying isn't compliance, I said. But it's a start. On the sidewalk, Alex jogged up, bright with hope. Your company. Can I apply? Will they even look? We raid portfolios blind, I said. Earn it. Even mine? He grinned. Especially yours, I answered. I drove away without shaking or rehearsing arguments. Not triumphant. Aligned. Not louder. Clearer. Self-rescued. Not saved. The house shrank in mirrors. The road faced forward. Mini-hook. Quiet followed me home. The kind you choose, not the kind they enforce. The drive back felt different than any trip before. Not retreat, not escape. A choice, my own. At Nexus the next morning, screens glowed and ideas flowed. This was the family I built. Chosen, not assigned. Here, I wasn't disappointment. I was leader. But echoes lingered. My mother's words still stung. Yet so did her silence after. Softer than usual. Whether she honored my boundaries no longer defined me. Brian's apology replayed. The golden child had his cage. Turns out, he envied my freedom as much as I envied his approval. 2 weeks later, I launched a scholarship fund. The Nexus Potential. Supporting students brave enough to choose their path. Not what families demanded. Not what tradition dictated. Proof that no dismissive voice should decide worth. At the launch, I said it plain. Innovation begins when you stop living someone else's script. Worth isn't measured by compliance, but by courage. Months passed. Calls with Brian grew real. Mom and I spoke less but differently. Tentative, awkward, honest. Then came her email. She wanted me to speak. A hospital fundraiser. Her world. Her stage. This time, not as her daughter, but as an equal voice at the table. Standing at that podium, I remembered it all. The dismissals. The comparisons. The beggar line. But also the night I chose to stand. My mother's face in the crowd. Eyes softened, defenses lowered. Not perfect, not healed, but shifted. The point was never revenge. Not proving her wrong, nor earning her praise. It was about being whole, regardless of either. So if you've ever been told you'll never measure up, hear me, they don't decide your height. Stand anyway. Build anyway. Become anyway. Have you faced family pressure and walked your own path? Share in the comments. You're not alone. Sometimes the loudest victory is living free on your own terms.
The clerk slid the stamped receipt across the counter, and for a moment, I just stared at it, unable to breathe. Years of scrimping, of working long nights while friends were out living their lives, had led to this single piece of paper. My mortgage gone. The house on Maplewood Lane was mine, free and clear. I pressed the paper flat against the counter as though I might absorb its weight through my fingertips. For the first time in my life, I felt steady, like the ground beneath me couldn't shift anymore. Driving home. I rehearsed how I might celebrate, maybe order takeout, maybe just open a bottle of the cheap wine I'd been saving for someday. It wasn't the kind of milestone that came with balloons or confetti. It was quiet, like me. That evening, I invited Sabine over, thinking even with all our history she might share in the relief of this moment. We sat at the kitchen table, the deed and final receipt still lying where I had placed them. She glanced at them once, then leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smirk I knew too well. "Pack your bags," she said casually, as if she were suggesting a weekend trip. "My family's moving in. You don't need this much space all to yourself." The words landed harder than I expected. My stomach tightened. The air seemed to thin, and for a beat I couldn't speak. I had imagined she might envy me, even dismiss my achievement, but not this. Not a demand that turned my greatest victory into her possession. I folded the receipt carefully, tucking it into my purse, my mind already shifting from celebration to defense. And in that silence, I realized this fight was only beginning. Sabine's smirk stayed with me long after she left that night. It wasn't new. It was the same expression she had worn since we were children, the one that always came right before I lost something I loved. When we were little, Sabine had a way of bending the world around her. If she wanted the bigger slice of cake, she got it. If she wanted my new sweater, our mother would tell me to share. "She's older," Mom would say, as though that explained everything. I learned early that Sabine didn't ask, she claimed, and people let her. I used to believe our mother didn't see me, that her eyes were always trained on Sabine's needs. But on quiet nights, when Sabine was out with friends and the house finally stilled, Mom would sit on the edge of my bed. She'd smooth my hair and whisper, "You'll understand one day, Maribel. Independence is the only shield that lasts. Don't waste yourself trying to match your sister's shadow. Build your own light." At the time, those words felt like scraps comfort given because she couldn't stop Sabine from taking more. But after she passed, they became the compass I carried. Every late shift, every dollar saved, every morning I walked past the for sale sign that once stood in front of my house, I remembered her voice. Independence. A shield. And yet, as Sabine's smug command echoed through my kitchen, I felt like the same little girl again, standing small while my sister grabbed what wasn't hers. The mortgage was my shield, and I had thought it unbreakable, but Sabine had always been skilled at finding cracks. I went to bed that night replaying our mother's words, determined not to forget them, because if history was repeating itself, I would need every ounce of that shield to hold the line. I woke before sunrise, unable to push Sabine's words from my mind. As the first light slipped through the blinds, I wandered through the rooms of my house, touching the walls, the door frames, the furniture I had chosen piece by piece. It wasn't just a house. It was every year I had gone without to make sure it became mine. There had been nights when I lived on instant noodles so I could send one more payment. Birthdays passed with no celebrations. Holidays marked only by a candle lit alone in the kitchen. While friends bought new cars or took trips to the coast, I patched up my old sedan and kept working. I had told myself it was temporary, that the sacrifice would one day mean something. And now it did. I thought of the long weekends spent buried in spreadsheets, chasing promotions in an office where no one remembered my name. I thought of the loneliness, of saying no to dinners out, of sitting with the ache of silence because I couldn't afford to split my attention or my savings. Every sacrifice had a face, a memory, a cost. Standing in the living room, I pressed my palm flat against the wall. My mother's voice came back to me. Build your own light. This house was that light. It had risen from all the pieces of myself I had given up along the way. It wasn't luxury. It was survival made solid. Brick and beam turned into proof that I could stand on my own. That was why Sabine's demand cut so deep. She hadn't been there for the long nights or the hollow days. She hadn't earned these walls, yet she looked at them as if they were hers for the taking. I knew then that letting her move in wasn't just about sharing space. It was about surrendering the very evidence that I had survived, and I wasn't ready to let that go. 2 days later, I came home from the grocery store to find a moving truck idling in my driveway. For a moment, I thought the driver was lost, until I saw Sabine's teenagers lugging boxes up my front steps, Paul directing them with a half-hearted wave like he was choreographing a dance. My chest went cold. I pulled into the garage and stepped out, bags still in my hands. "What is this?" I demanded. Sabine appeared in the doorway, sunglasses perched on her head, a box tucked under her arm. "What does it look like we're moving in?" You have all this space. Maribel, it's wasteful. I set the grocery bags down on the concrete, forcing myself to breathe. This is my house. You don't just show up with a truck. Paul shrugged as he passed by, carrying a box labeled kitchen. It's logical. You don't need a whole house to yourself. Families need homes. His tone was smug, as though reason itself was on his side. I followed them inside, my heart pounding as I watched Rowan and Celia push my books off the shelves to make room for their things. "Stop," I said, sharper than I intended. The kids glanced at me, smirked, and kept going. Sabine set her box down on the counter with a thud. "You always did cling to things. Mom would have wanted family under one roof. You should be grateful we're willing to share this place with you." The words stung. A familiar blade turned against me. I looked at the walls I'd sacrificed years to keep standing, now invaded by the noise of voices that treated it like a prize to be divided. My sanctuary was being stripped in front of me, brick by brick, box by box. But instead of shouting, I picked up my groceries and walked into the kitchen, every step deliberate. I could feel Sabine's eyes on me, waiting for a fight, but I wouldn't give her one, not yet. I placed the milk in the fridge, the bread on the counter, and let the silence settle like a blade between us. Because if she thought I was powerless, she hadn't seen what I could do when pressed against the wall. That evening, Sabine insisted we all sit down together for dinner, as though her arrival had somehow redefined the rules of my home. She'd already spread her things across the guest room, her children's belongings spilling into the hallway like weeds creeping through cracks. I cooked out of habit, though the sight of her family crowding around my table made every bite taste bitter. Halfway through the meal, Sabine raised her glass with a triumphant smile. "This house is meant for family," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make sure I understood what she meant. "It's too much for one person to keep to herself. We'll make it a real home." Paul nodded in agreement, and even the kids grinned, as if my silence was proof they'd already won. I set my fork down, the scrape against the plate louder than their laughter. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I kept my face calm. I leaned forward, my voice soft, almost tender, and whispered 4 words. "Check the deed tomorrow." The room stilled. For a moment, Sabine's eyes flickered, the certainty in them dimming. Then she laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You've always had a flair for dramatics, Maribel, but words don't change the truth." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I excused myself from the table, leaving their chatter to fill the space behind me. Upstairs, I locked my bedroom door, pulled out the folder where I kept every document that proved what was mine, and slipped it into my bag. The next morning, while Sabine was still asleep, I crossed the street to Mr. Keating's porch. He was already outside, reading the paper with his glasses low on his nose. When I told him what had happened, his expression hardened. "You've been patient long enough," he said. "It's time to remind them where they stand." By the time I walked back across the street, the weight of fear had shifted into something steadier. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I had the deed, the law, and my mother's words as armor, and tomorrow, Sabine would understand the difference between claiming something and owning it. The next morning broke heavy and gray, the kind of sky that pressed low over the street. I woke early, slipping downstairs before the rest of the house stirred. By the time Sabine's family began clattering in the kitchen, the paper was already pinned neatly to the front door, a formal warning drafted by Mr. Keating, citing my ownership and the unlawful occupation of my property. I heard Rowan's voice first. Mom, there's something on the door." His tone carried the nervousness of someone who didn't understand the weight of official letterhead. Chairs scraped, footsteps shuffled. Then came Sabine's sharp intake of breath. "What is this supposed to mean?" Her words were pitched higher than usual, as though she hadn't expected consequences. I stepped into the hallway, calm, coffee mug in hand. "It means you don't live here." I said evenly. Paul pulled the notice from the door, reading it aloud with a frown. Unlawful occupation, legal enforcement if ignored. His eyes darted to me. You wouldn't actually go through with this. Wouldn't I asked. The room hung in silence, broken only by the sound of Celia muttering, "This is embarrassing." By then, neighbors had noticed. Mrs. Whitaker from across the street slowed her morning walk, peering at the paper still taped in place. Another neighbor waved his phone, already snapping pictures. Gossip spread faster than the breeze. Sabine's face flushed a furious red. She tore the notice down, crumpled it, and slammed it on the counter. "You think this scares me?" she snapped. "You're just bluffing, Mary Bell." I held her gaze and took a slow sip of my coffee. Then keep testing it. The confidence she carried into my home days earlier began to crack. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her posture, the way her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the countertop. Rowan and Celia retreated upstairs, whispering under their breath. Paul muttered about overreaction, though he didn't sound convinced, and Sabine stood there, her authority slipping like sand through her fingers. I turned and walked toward the kitchen window, watching the neighbors drift away, knowing word was already spreading. The balance in the house had shifted, and for once, it tilted toward me. By the end of the week, Sabine was already on the phone with anyone who would listen. I overheard her in the living room, voice dripping with righteous indignation. "She's trying to throw us out into the street. Her own sister. Can you imagine someone so heartless?" The performance was convincing enough, but she underestimated how small towns worked. People remembered who signed checks, who held steady jobs, who stayed up late at their desks while others drifted from one failed venture to the next. My neighbors had seen me come and go for years, groceries balanced on one hip, laptop bag on the other. They knew exactly who had been paying the bills that kept this house standing. It didn't take long for whispers to circle back to me. Mrs. Whitaker, never one to keep gossip to herself, told me she'd heard Sabine crying to half the street about being betrayed. Then she lowered her voice and added, "But everyone knows better. You built this place, Maribel. People aren't blind." I thanked her, though inside I felt the sting of relief. For years, Sabine's words had cut deeper than truth, bending our family into her narrative. This time, the facts were too solid to twist. The deed had my name alone, and now the community knew it too. At dinner, Sabine tried again, launching into a speech about family unity and sacrifice, but her voice lacked its former confidence. Paul sat quietly, avoiding my eyes. The children pushed food around their plates, no longer so eager to jeer. The cracks had spread from the walls of the house into the fabric of her own family. I cleared the dishes in silence, letting her words hang unanswered. The power she once wielded so easily was slipping, and she knew it. Tomorrow, those cracks would widen. The notice should have been enough. Any reasonable person would have packed up and left. But Sabine thrived on defiance. By the second week, her boxes weren't stacked in corners anymore. They were unpacked, their contents spilling into my space as though they'd always belonged. I walked into the living room one morning to find my books swept aside, replaced by her framed family photos. Paul was on a ladder, hammering nails into my wall to hang their wedding portrait. "It'll look better here," he muttered, not even bothering to ask. Rowan had taken over my den, his video game console plugged into the outlet where I used to keep my work printer. Celia dragged her laundry basket into the hallway, leaving a trail of clothes that made my home feel like a dormitory. Through it all, Sabine held her head high, convinced she had already won. "See?" she said one evening, gesturing toward the rearranged rooms. "Doesn't it feel more alive now? A house needs family, not empty silence." I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped quiet pictures when they weren't looking, and tucked every change into a folder of evidence. Each click was a reminder that patience was its own form of resistance. At night, when they slept. I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the folder, my mother's voice echoing in memory. Independence is the only shield that lasts. I was building mine carefully. Each document, each photo, another layer of armor. Sabine thought my silence was surrender. She mistook stillness for weakness. But all the while, I was preparing. The next step would not be a warning pinned to the door. It would be the strike that ended this battle once and for all. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the sheriff himself. His knock echoed through the house, cutting through Sabine's chatter like a blade. She opened the door, her smile faltering when she saw the uniform, and within minutes the truth lay in her shaking hands. The eviction was no longer a threat. It was an order. Paul cursed under his breath. Rowan and Celia stood frozen, and Sabine's voice climbed higher and higher, insisting there had been a mistake. The sheriff remained calm, firm. They had 72 hours to leave, and if they refused, the law would finish the work. The next days unraveled quickly. Sabine's confidence crumbled into frantic whispers, then into rage. She snapped at Paul, blaming him for not supporting her. He snapped back, accusing her of pushing too far. The children sulked in corners, embarrassed by the public spectacle. Neighbors slowed their cars, watching the shouting spill onto the porch. By the third day, the sheriff returned to enforce the order. Boxes were dragged back out to the driveway, but this time there was no smirk on Sabine's face. Paul refused to carry more than his share. Rowan stormed off after being scolded, and Celia cried openly, saying she hated all of it. I stood inside, steady while they packed. It wasn't triumph, I felt only the deep weight of an ending long overdue. When the last box left the threshold and the sheriff closed the door, silence settled over the rooms like a blessing. For the first time in weeks, the house was mine again, though its walls still echoed with the chaos they had brought. I leaned against the door, breathing in the quiet, already knowing what needed to come next. The morning after they left, I called a locksmith. The sharp click of new locks sliding into place felt like a line drawn across my life. No one would walk through that door again without my choosing. For the first time in weeks, I brewed coffee without the sound of voices invading the kitchen. The silence wasn't empty. It was mine. I spent the next days reclaiming every corner of the house. I pulled down the photos Sabine had hung, patched the holes Paul had left in the walls, and moved my books back onto their shelves. Each small act was a restoration, a reminder that the sacrifices I'd made hadn't been for nothing. I painted the guest room in a soft sage, not for anyone else, but because I liked it. When I finally stood back in the living room, breathing in the faint scent of new paint and lemon polish, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. My mother's words echoed softly. Independence is the only shield that lasts. She had been right. This house was never just brick and wood. It was the proof of my endurance, the vessel for my dignity. Owning it was one thing. Defending it, refusing to let it be taken, was another. And as I looked around at the space that once felt invaded, I saw it transformed, not just a house, but a home that carried my name, my work, my truth. I sat by the window as the sun fell across the porch, knowing I had finally built more than walls. I had built the life my mother told me to claim, and no one would ever strip it from me again. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I slipped into the back row of the ceremonial courtroom. No one turned when I entered, and that was fine. No one expected me to be here anyway. I settled into a seat no one had reserved, folding my hands in my lap, keeping my gaze low. Up front, my parents were impossible to miss. My father's posture was straight, his suit pressed within an inch of perfection. My mother's pearls caught the light each time she tilted her head to whisper to the woman beside her. My younger sister, Corinne, sat between them, radiant with pride as she prepared to take her oath. Every detail was arranged as if for a portrait, the golden child about to be sworn into the Massachusetts bar, the proud parents glowing in reflected success. I caught fragments of their voices. At least one of our children didn't give up, my mother murmured, her lips tight but smiling. My father raised his chin a fraction higher, as if the words themselves polished the family's image. I didn't flinch. I'd heard variations of that phrase for more than a decade, long enough that the sting had dulled into something else, an ache that never quite left, but no longer broke the skin. To them, I was the failure who had walked away from Harvard Medical School, the one who cracked under pressure, the one who couldn't keep up. That narrative had settled like dust in every corner of our family's life, repeated often enough that it became truth to everyone but me. I let them believe it. It was safer that way. Corinne straightened as the judge entered, and the room rose to its feet in unison. The judge's voice carried across the chamber, but my mind drifted, tugged backward by memories that had become all too familiar. I could see the long oak table in our dining room at home, polished so carefully that the chandelier reflected off its surface. Corinne always sat at my father's right hand, her posture immaculate, her smile timed to perfection. I sat a little further down, a shadow at the edge of the family portrait. Corinne's professor said she has the makings of a litigator already, my mother would announce, her pride swelling until it filled the room. Laughter followed, glasses clinked, and all eyes turned toward her, the promise of the Rowan name carried neatly in her hands. Then came the inevitable comparison, a pause just long enough to remind everyone of me. Of course, Celine is still finding her way. A polite chuckle, sometimes a sigh. Once, an uncle leaned across the table with a smirk and said, "Better to quit early than to waste more tuition." My father didn't correct him. He just pressed his lips into a line and refilled his wine. Even the silences carried weight. When Corinne passed her ethics exam, the family toasted with champagne. When I withdrew from Harvard, no one raised a glass. My name became shorthand for disappointment, woven into jokes too sharp to laugh at. I learned to school my face, to butter my roll without trembling fingers, to let their words pass through me as if I were glass. What they never knew, what they were never meant to know, was that the moment I stepped away from their world, another door had opened, one they couldn't imagine. The gavel struck lightly at the front of the room, pulling me back to the present. Corinne rose with confidence, ready to take her oath, while I remained in the shadows, carrying the truth that none of them had ever bothered to ask for. There was a time when my name at Harvard Medical carried weight. First-year anatomy, neurophysiology, pharmacology. I devoured them all. My professors praised my focus. My classmates whispered about my grades. I lived in the library, slept with flashcards under my pillow, convinced that if I kept my head down, I could carve a place for myself in a world where precision meant everything. It unraveled the day I opened the wrong folder. At first, I thought it was a filing mistake, a memo tucked into a research summary that had nothing to do with it. But the numbers didn't lie. A funding stream traced back to a pharmaceutical company, tied neatly to a faculty member's name, and to a grant that had guaranteed one of my classmates a prestigious clerkship. It wasn't just sloppy, it was intentional. I took it to the ethics board, certain I was doing the right thing. Within a week, my access to internal systems was revoked. A professor who once praised my surgical simulations now refused to acknowledge me in the hall. Study partners drifted away, whispering behind their hands. The girl who never faltered was suddenly the cautionary tale. When the call came, it was from an unlisted number. The woman on the other end spoke calmly, her tone professional but not unkind. She told me she worked with a division inside the Department of Justice, one that specialized in medical ethics and corruption. They had been watching my school, she said, watching certain faculty, certain deals, and someone like me observant, unwilling to look away, might have value. If I was willing to leave one world behind and step into another, I signed the withdrawal papers the next day. My parents thought I had cracked under the weight. My mother asked if I was pregnant. My father refused to speak to me for weeks. But by then, I was already filling out clearance forms, already memorizing case files, already stepping into a life that required silence. Corinne's oath echoed in the present courtroom. But my mind held another vow, the one I had made in secrecy, to serve justice in the shadows. The day I left Harvard, the story my family told about me hardened into stone. To them, I was the one who cracked under pressure, the daughter who had wasted her potential. They never asked questions after that, never wanted the details. It was easier to fold me into silence, to make me the shadow to Corinne's light. That shadow became my cover. On paper, I was a research assistant drifting between private firms, a dropout who never quite landed. In reality, my days were spent in windowless rooms with sealed files, tracing the invisible veins of money that fed corruption. I sifted through records of clinical trials padded with ghost patients, hospital boards approving experimental drugs in exchange for quiet donations, doctors receiving kickbacks for prescriptions that harmed more than they healed. It wasn't glamorous. Some nights blurred into dawn under fluorescent lights, my eyes raw from hours of reading ledgers. Other days I walked into hospitals under an assumed name, clipboard in hand, smiling like any junior analyst while cataloging violations that could collapse entire systems. Every file I touched had real lives buried inside patients whose trust had been betrayed, whose suffering had been monetized. That weight never left me. But the job demanded stillness. No recognition, no applause, no trace of my name. If I was successful, the public never knew. Cases closed quietly, indictments sealed, whistleblowers protected by signatures no one would connect to me. I wore anonymity like armor, because exposure meant risk, not just to me, but to the work itself. At Christmas dinners, when relatives asked what I was doing, my father would say, "She's in research now. Nothing to do with law." They nodded, half listening, before turning back to Corinne's latest achievements. I smiled, offered polite answers, and let them look past me. It was safer that way. Years passed in this rhythm. My family's disappointment calcified, but so did my resolve. Silence became both shield and weapon, a way to exist in their world while living fully in another. And so, on the day of Corinne's swearing in, I slipped into the back row unseen, carrying 12 years of secrets in plain sight, until the judge stepped to the podium and met my eyes. The room shifted when Judge Harold Stone stepped forward. His presence carried the same weight it always had: broad shoulders, a voice built for authority, a polished smile that had charmed neighbors and politicians alike. To my family, he was a friend of decades, a man who had dined at our table and raised his glass at holiday toasts. To me, he was the central figure in an ongoing investigation, his name traced across offshore accounts and illicit donations hidden behind shell companies. I sat perfectly still as he adjusted his papers, beginning his remarks with the kind of ease born from habit. He congratulated the candidates, reminded them of the sacred duty of ethics, wove words together with the confidence of a man who believed his image unshakable. My parents watched with pride, my father leaning forward as if these were words he himself could have written. But then Stone's gaze lifted, sweeping across the rows until it landed on me. For a moment, his practiced rhythm faltered. Recognition sparked, quick and sharp, followed by something else: awareness, perhaps even guilt. I held his stare, just long enough to acknowledge what we both knew, before lowering my eyes. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then, unexpectedly, he cleared his throat and set the papers aside. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice resonant but edged with strain, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone present today, someone whose integrity reshaped my view of law, though not in the way she may have intended." A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. Stone's gaze settled firmly on me. "Thank you, Dr. Celine Rowan." The words struck like a gavel. The air changed instantly. Heads turned, necks craned, whispers erupted, then died in the weight of silence. I saw my father's hand tighten around the arm of his chair until it trembled. My mother's breath hitched audibly, her posture frozen. Corinne stiffened beside them, her confidence cracking into disbelief. I did not move. Years of training kept my face calm, my breathing even, but inside, every instinct sharpened. I had come prepared for many outcomes, but not for this being seen in a room where I had been invisible all my life. Stone lifted his papers again, resuming the speech as though nothing had happened, but the courtroom would not forget, and neither would my family. When the ceremony ended and the applause began, I knew the reckoning I had avoided for years would come before the day was done. The reception hall hummed with the usual polite chatter and clinking of glasses, but beneath it ran a different current. Conversations faltered as people glanced my way, then looked quickly back as though they hadn't. I stood near the edge of the room, a glass of ginger ale untouched in my hand, watching trays of hors d'oeuvres circle past. It didn't take long. My father's voice cut through the crowd, low but commanding. DOJ. Since when his eyes pinned me from across the room, sharp and searching, the same look he used to level at witnesses on the stand. I didn't flinch. Since Harvard, I answered evenly. I was recruited during the ethics investigation. I didn't drop out. I was asked to leave one world to serve in another. For a moment. There was only stillness. My mother's hand shook as she adjusted her bracelet. Her lips parted, but no words coming. She looked as though the ground beneath her had tilted. Corinne stepped forward, her expression tight, her voice edged with something between curiosity and disbelief. That DA case last year, the one with the sealed indictments, was that your team? I let the question hang before replying. The prosecutor flagged in that case was on our radar 2 years earlier. Let's just say you weren't arguing alone. Her eyes widened, the certainty in her face flickering into something more complicated. My father exhaled, a slow, measured breath that sounded like it belonged in a courtroom. He was recalculating everything he thought he knew, every word he had ever spoken about me in disappointment. My mother finally spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We thought you were lost. I wasn't, I said gently. I was doing exactly what I was trained to do. You just weren't allowed to know. No one applauded. No one cried. But for the first time in years, no one looked past me either. The silence was heavier. Yes, but it was the kind that acknowledged presence, not absence. And as the evening thinned, I knew the reckoning wasn't finished. It would follow me home. The house felt smaller than I remembered. The walls, once looming and untouchable, seemed worn at the edges. The colors faded. My mother disappeared upstairs without a word, her footsteps careful on the carpet. My father remained near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze heavy but unreadable. When my mother returned, she carried a cardboard box, its edges taped and yellowed with time. She set it gently on the coffee table, smoothing her palm across the lid before peeling it open. I kept these, she said quietly. I don't know why. I just couldn't throw them away. Inside lay pieces of a life I had been forced to abandon. My Harvard ID badge, bent at the corners, a folder of commendations I never showed them, notes from professors about clerkships that never came to pass. Beneath the stack was a thin envelope, still sealed. She handed it to me with trembling fingers. This came last year. No return address. We didn't know what it meant. I slid the paper free. A certificate from the Department of Justice, intentionally vague, recognizing service in matters of national integrity and judicial security, nothing explicit, nothing traceable, but real nonetheless. My father stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the page as though it were a declassified file. His jaw tightened, then slowly eased. You protected people like me, he said finally, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. And I failed you. He extended his hand, not the gesture of a father reclaiming authority, but of a man offering respect. For a moment, I hesitated, then placed my hand in his. The grip was steady, and it carried weight I had waited years to feel. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, but it was the first crack in the wall between us, and I knew more would follow. Weeks later, I walked through the side gate of my parents' backyard without hesitation. Folding chairs lined the lawn, neighbors balancing paper plates on their laps, children chasing each other near the fence. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid hung in the air, the same as every gathering before, but this time I didn't linger in the driveway or wait for someone to notice me. I carried a dish of berry crumble and placed it on the table as though I had always belonged. My father spotted me first. He straightened from the grill, not stiff with formality, but tall with pride. "Everyone," he said, drawing the attention of his circle of colleagues and old friends. "This is my daughter, Dr. Rowan, Department of Justice." There was no hesitation in his voice, no careful pause to soften the introduction. Just fact. A few heads nodded respectfully, and the weight of it settled quietly into the air. I hadn't expected applause, and none came, but the absence of dismissal felt like a kind of ceremony all its own. Later, near the cooler, Corinne found me. She carried 2 plates stacked high and offered me one with a crooked smile. For a moment, she studied me, her expression caught between pride and something sharper. "All this time," she said, "I thought I was carrying the family's name. Turns out you were carrying the weight none of us could see." Her tone wasn't bitter, but it wasn't free of envy either. I met her eyes and held them, letting silence answer what words couldn't. She laughed softly, shaking her head, and handed me the plate. The sky darkened into shades of rose as sparklers flickered in the hands of children. For the first time in years, I wasn't outside the circle watching. I was in it, on my own terms. And the night felt different because of it. In the quiet after the gathering, I sat alone on the back porch, the sound of laughter fading into the hum of cicadas. For years, my silence had been mistaken for surrender, my absence written as proof of failure. I let them believe it because the truth was too heavy to explain, and because the work demanded shadows, not spotlights. Now, with my father's words still echoing, "This is my daughter, Dr. Rowan. D.O.J." I understood how easily a single sentence could rewrite years of judgment. Yet, as warming as that recognition felt, I realized I hadn't been waiting for it. My worth had never depended on their applause. It had been measured in the whistleblowers I protected, the patients shielded from fraud, the cases closed without fanfare. Recognition from family was new, fragile, and welcome. But it wasn't the foundation of my life. The true foundation was built in sealed courtrooms, encrypted files, late nights chasing trails that no one would ever connect to my name. That was where justice lived, not in their approval, but in the quiet victories that never touched the headlines. I thought back to the girl I once was, bent over her medical textbooks, believing success was defined by titles and degrees. She would never have imagined that the greatest measure of her life would be invisible to those she loved most. But perhaps invisibility had been its own kind of shield, until now, as the last sparkler fizzled out in the yard. I stood, ready to step back into a life where the applause didn't matter. Only the work did, and I knew the story wasn't finished. Not for me, not for them. I thought back to that first moment in the courtroom, sitting alone in the back row while my family whispered about failure. For so long, I had let their story define me, the daughter who quit, the one who couldn't keep up. I carried that silence like a burden, but it had been my shield, too. Now I understood what those years had really meant. Silence wasn't surrender. It was discipline. It was the space that allowed me to do the work no one else could see. It was the cost of protecting what mattered. When Judge Stone spoke my name, the narrative they had clung to cracked apart for the first time. They saw me not as the girl who disappeared, but as the woman who had chosen to walk a different road. That recognition mattered, but not in the way I once imagined. What mattered was knowing that even in silence, I had never abandoned myself. Dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly at the edge of a room, waiting for truth to arrive. Sometimes it looks like weakness until the moment it stands and cannot be ignored. I no longer needed to prove my worth to them, or to anyone. The life I built in shadows was enough, and time had spoken for me, because in the end, truth doesn't whisper. It waits, it endures, and when the moment comes, it speaks so clearly no one can look away.